There's a mistake. Moonlight, you guys won Best Picture.
You like me. Right now. You like me.
Ever since I was a little kid, I wanted this.
Mom, I just want an Oscar.
I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of the Ultimate Oscar Showdown. And this week we're going to be concluding our analysis of the Best Supporting Actor category by breaking down the decade of the 1970s, the winners from that decade, and ranking them in a tier list from S tier being the highest all the way to D tier being the lowest. Next week, if you've been following along, you should know that it will be the Best Supporting Actress category, and we're going to be jumping back to the 2010s, starting off with the 2010s, then the 2000s, then the 90s, and the 80s, and the 70s, and then the series will be over tier ranking the Supporting Actress category. If you're new to the series and are just coming to this video, welcome. What we've been doing for the past few months has been tier ranking a bunch of different Oscar categories, including Best Lead Actor, Best Lead Actress, Best Picture, and then of course Supporting Actor. So subscribe to the channel if you want to continue on into this journey. We've got a month or so left, pretty much of videos before we jump back into the old Oscar Countdown series, which I've been doing now, which will be my 7th or 8th season at this point. So lots of exciting stuff, getting ready for that, but still having lots of fun with the series. A series which you guys have been enjoying a lot, commenting below, still liking the videos, still throughout all these months, which is greatly appreciated to me. I love to hear your guys' comments, so please do in the comments down below. Let me know your thoughts, your own personal tier rankings. I love to hear that, particularly for this decade, because you got some weird ones, you got some interesting performances. I love to hear your thoughts if you've seen some of these movies. So let's start off with the 1970 winner, John Mills, for Ryan's Daughter, and we have to start out on a little bit of a negative note. This is a bad performance, and you know, the movie itself, Ryan's Daughter, I think is largely seen as a disappointment, and I consider it that way. I actually don't consider it a bad movie. You know, this was a moment where it reminds me a lot of Godfather Part 3, where of course the first two Godfathers were masterpieces, and then when the third one came out, and it was good, but maybe not a masterpiece, people felt the need to nominate for Best Picture because, well, maybe we're wrong about this and it will be reclaimed later on, so we'll nominate for Best Picture, we'll give it a bunch of nominations at the very least. Similarly here with Ryan's Daughter, where you have David Lean coming off of Dr. Zhivago and Lawrence of Arabia, and Bridge on the River Kwai. Bridge on the River Kwai and Lawrence of Arabia are two Best Picture winners, and then Dr. Zhivago was not a Best Picture winner, but was nominated for Best Picture and was a huge box office hit, one of the all-time box office hits of all time. And then you have David Lean with Ryan's Daughter. So it got, you know, a couple of Oscar nominations and then won one for here, but particularly, you know, looking back on it, it's just a poor Oscar win. You have to keep in mind it's 50 years ago now, so over 50 years ago, so the times are different, so you have to keep that in mind. But ultimately, you know, we're looking at this movie from a 2023 viewpoint, and if I were to recommend this movie, it'd be to someone watching it in this year. And the performance just fails on a bunch of different aspects, unfortunately. Of course, the first one is that it's just generally offensive in regards to its portrayal of people with mental disabilities. Very insensitive in just terms of how it's being portrayed and used for humor. That being said, also the character within the movie and then the performance is, I think, miscalibrated in that sometimes it's being used for broad humor, which are expected laughs. You know, I didn't really laugh at those moments, but maybe they were, you know, expected to be laughed at during the time. But then you have also other moments when pretty quickly after you expect there to be great sympathy. So there's sort of a disconnect there where you want someone to laugh at them in one scene, and in the next scene you want us to feel really bad for them and have an emotional connection. That's a huge leap to make, and I think ultimately the performance at times can be so broad, so over the top in an attempt for comedy, but then other times asks you to be more subtle and sympathize with the character. It's not only, I think, an offensive performance for modern day times, it's also just a performance that doesn't work within the context of the movie. So while I actually don't hate the movie, I think it's got some redeeming elements, this is the most surprising one that even got a nomination, let alone an actual win. So unfortunately, this is probably the only performance in this entire series that's not just meh, but actually actively bad. So I'm going to have to put this one in the D tier. Then the 1971 winner, Ben Johnson, for The Last Picture Show, which was actually a first-time watch for me and a really terrific film. I really enjoyed it quite a bit. And one of those movies where you could see any of the performances win an Oscar. Of course, we had a Cloris Leachman win as well. But here with Ben Johnson, well-deserved win, and it makes sense for the win just because of how his character is within the film. I mean, he's very much the older, wiser mentor, fatherly figure to these two boys, played by Jeff Bridges and Timothy Bottoms. Perfectly cast within the film just because he seems like a guy who's lived a life. He's got that face, so there's a sense of authenticity just by casting him in this part. And what's interesting about the movie is that it's a great supporting performance. You know, I've been struggling with this topic throughout the past few videos because usually when I think of acting performances, I like the lead acting performances because they have more acting scenes, they have more chances to show off their acting abilities. So it's difficult with the supporting roles because sometimes you just don't get a lot with the performance, so you struggle with whether or not you should enjoy the performance or not. So usually my performances that are almost co-leads of the movie get higher rankings probably than people that are just in one or two scenes, unless their scenes are really impactful. But what's interesting about Ben Johnson here is that it's a performance I love, and it's also a performance that is a clear supporting actor performance. I mean, he's got really 2-3 scenes, delivers a monologue in 2 of those scenes, and that's his impact within the film. But what's so great about his role and his character in general is just how integral that his role is to the overall sort of, I think, tone and feeling of the film, where things go awry once we don't have Ben Johnson's character within the film. And he's great in those scenes, delivering those monologues, keeping his head relatively still, doesn't move around too much, looking off just off camera, and has this great sort of storytelling wistfulness ability when he's reminiscing about these past times and trying to impart some wisdom onto these young boys by sort of reliving his own past and telling you sort of intimate stories. He's just got that great storytelling rhythm of delivering his lines, but also keeping his face relatively still and just sort of beating his eyes and looking off into the distance to ultimately create an engaging effect and a really empowering effect. So Johnson doesn't have a lot to do within the film ultimately, but what he is asked to do, he absolutely nails it and is integral for the success of the film. His performance, not only his character, but the way he performs it and the way he makes us believe that this is the guy who's lived here for his entire life and has had these experiences. Even though he's an actor and hasn't had these experiences, you feel like it's coming from the depth of this man's soul. It's really a terrific performance. It's not a lot, but it's perfect for what it is. So for me, it will go into the S tier. Then the 1972 winner, Joel Grey for Cabaret. I talked about the movie when discussing Liza Minnelli because she won Best Lead Actress for the film. I talked about how she was the heart of the film and deservedly, I think, won the Oscar that year. So why did Joel Grey also win the Oscar? I don't know. You tell me. This is a really fascinating performance to think about because it's not really an acting performance. It's almost a theatrical performance within a film. It feels like if you're watching a play, like a film version of Hamilton or something, in that Joel Grey's character isn't really a character. He's only on stage. He only performs and is the MC, and he's excellent at being the MC of the film, but it's almost as if you were to reward David Byrne for Best Lead Actor for Stop Making Sense. A great film, a great performance, but is it a great acting performance or is it something else? That's something I struggle with because we don't see him off the stage, Joel Grey's character. We just see him on stage. He's not part of the main storyline. Interesting, yes, but ultimately at the end of the day, I didn't have any sort of emotional connection aside from the sort of showing off of the talents that go on the stage. So I just don't know how to judge a performance ultimately because it's a performance and not necessarily a character. So I struggled with that and ultimately felt a little bit not super moved by the performance because I'm not sure if I'm even supposed to. So I don't know exactly how to feel about this. I'd love for you guys to comment down below. So for me, I'm just going to put this one in the C tier. Then the 1973 winner, John Houseman for The Paper Chase. And this was an actor I didn't know anything about, so I was interested to look into his career. And I went through IMDb and noticed that he had one credited acting performance in the 30s, and then this being his next credited acting performance, which is fascinating. And I read into his life and then learned more about how he was a really producer for most of his life and was instrumental with the Mercury Theatre, working with Orson Welles, and instrumental in making Citizen Kane during that period, and then became a studio executive and was to do executive for RKO and MGM and Paramount throughout the 50s and 60s. And then eventually founded the drama department at Juilliard and started that up and worked there. And then, you know, was cast in this movie and won an Oscar, and then became a great sort of character actor throughout the 70s and 80s. Fascinating career. You know, I'm very happy to have watched the movie and done this series just to find out more about John Houseman, because of course I know about Orson Welles and the Mercury Theatre, but not so much, and I guess didn't sort of to connect the dots that this actor was also the producer that helped found the Mercury Theatre and was so collaborative in those early days. But because we talk about the performance here, ultimately it's sort of just fine. I think it's a performance that probably was rewarded because of all the respect people had for Houseman and for his connections with the drama department in Juilliard and some of the acting troupes that he worked with. I'm sure he had lots of friends, so that helped him here. And he is serviceable at being the sort of very professional professor who doesn't really know his students' names outside of class. He's just sort of there to preach. But as a result, we don't get too much interiority of his life. He feels very steely, he feels very cold, he feels very mysterious, which works well within the sake of the film. But every time we actually try to learn more about him, we see him outside of class, we don't get anything. I don't think Houseman brings a lot to that, or demanded a lot to that, to try to make him seem more of an actual person, more so than just an iconic sort of legendary figure within the student Timothy Bottom's mind. So, you know, he's serviceable for what he's being asked to do, but he just doesn't bring much to the character, so it will go into the C tier. Then the 1974 winner, Robert De Niro, for The Godfather Part 2. So what is there to be said? You know, it's an amazing film, an incredibly difficult task. The fact that the person who played this character last was Marlon Brando, one of the greatest actors of all time. He won an Oscar for this performance. The movie was a big hit. It was a Best Picture winner, and now you're one of the main characters that's really introduced within the film. In the sequel, you just had some, you know, buzz from early on in Mean Streets and working with Brian De Palma and movies like Hi Mom, and then finally you get this big opportunity, and De Niro just absolutely nails it. What I think is interesting and a challenge, because you have to work off another performer's already existing performance, but De Niro is perfectly cast and great at doing the sort of calmness and the reservedness that Brando established within the first Godfather, extending that and always showing us more rather than even making us feel that necessary emotion. That we have to understand that Vito is a person with morals and integrity and family focus. And the way you do that, I think, and De Niro ultimately showcases those morals, is through his actions and through the subtlety of his looks. Whether it be him coming home with a pear for his wife and the way he sets it on the table, or the way he just looks at her or holds her hand. There's these small little things where you immediately go like, oh, this seems pure, this seems honest, there's real love here. And he's not saying anything, there's no line deliveries. It's just the way he's so confident and assured with his actions, or the way he looks at places, or when he's walking down the street and he's perusing the streets and he's looking around. The calmness, the slowness of his movements all add up to a sense of security and then an understanding as an audience member as, oh, we understand why this guy was ultimately successful. He feels like he has everything in control and he's in control. And De Niro's sort of slow but deliberate physicality, subtle physicality within this film is very underrated, and I think is excellent at really helping us understand and fill in the gaps of even Brando's performance of the first one, taking it and then running with it and making it even more in depth. So incredible performance from such a young actor in De Niro, and still I think one of his better performances, which is a testament to De Niro, who has had such an amazing career. So for me, this will go into the S tier. Then the 1975 winner, George Burns, for The Sunshine Boys, which was a movie I hadn't even heard of, but then quickly learned, oh, this is one of the sort of Neil Simon movies of the mid to late 70s, where America fell in love with Neil Simon and all of his plays were being adapted into films, and those films were getting a lot of Oscars for their actors. You have George Burns for The Sunshine Boys, Maggie Smith for California Suite. You had Richard Dreyfuss for The Goodbye Girl in this sort of late period, and And eventually sort of that shtick, I think, kind of fell away, but you understood why it was such a popular kind of shtick during this late period in the sort of mid to late 70s, because we get very witty dialogue, fast-paced dialogue, and as a result feels very intellectual or funny, which Burns is a testament to him, and his performance, I think, really works well within the film and adapts to this kind of quick-witted pace of dialogue. He's essentially the co-lead of the film, but because it doesn't come in until later in the film, I guess he can be campaigned as a supporting actor. But his best scenes are the dynamic between him and Walter Matthau, the back and forth, and an interesting kind of an element that he brings to his character, in which he has to be sort of the same side of, or the different side of the same coin with Matthau's performance. We have to understand why these two were so impactful vaudevillian performers that have been together for years. But then we also have to understand why they ultimately broke up and why they're kind of different. So we have to understand why they're the same and why they're different. And Burns sort of matches himself to Matthau's performance, some of the sort of tics and grumpiness and specificities that he has. But then also he's a little bit sweeter than Matthau's character, so we understand why maybe they were able to work out in the end. There's a little bit of a yin and a yang, but we also understand that they have that kind of playful banter of an old married couple. And Burns works well at delivering those lines of dialogue, at keeping up with the pace, at being very funny, and lots of very funny facial expressions. It can be somewhat annoying at times, but for the most part, Burns is sweet, is lovable, and very funny within the film. So good performance that will go into the B tier. Then the 1976 winner, Jason Robards, for All the President's Men, a back-to-back Oscar winner performer in. Then the 1976 winner, Jason Robards, for All the President's Men, winning here and then also winning next year in the same category for Julia. The Academy was definitely in love with Jason Robards at this time. And I think if you've seen both films, All the President's Men and Julia, everyone probably agrees that All the President's Men is the better performance. He's maybe not my personal favorite performance within the film. It's got so many great performances of Jack Warden and Hal Holbrook, and of course the two leads in Redford and Houseman, but he is solid in the movie. I think he gives the movie a real sense of authenticity, and there's great small subtle physical things that he's able to do, which gives this movie a sense, and his performance, a sense of authenticity. It makes sense just the way he sits in a chair or has his sleeves rolled up. Particularly there's one scene, really our first introductory scene of him, when he reviews the first draft and tells the boys that essentially won't go to story yet because there's not enough, there's too much conjecture. Just the way he puts his feet up on the desk or holds the red pen just ever so slightly. It feels like he's done this a million times. Small things where he'll just sigh out or look over, at the top of his eyes as he's looking down on the paper to glance up and look at them. These small things that give it a sense of, oh, this feels like a good boss, a boss that will fight for his guys, which he eventually does, but also somebody that's not just going to accept whatever and allow his paper to allow them to run anything and to run sort of half-assed stories. There's just a sense, I think, of authenticity, of seniority that he brings. He feels like a guy who's been in the trench rooms of newsroom for a long time, and he does that through great line deliveries and exasperation in many instances, but also because of the smaller subtle things, crossing his arms, sitting in a chair, holding a pen. These small little decisions that add up to a sense of believability and authenticity within the film. So he's very solid within the film, and I think a really good award winner here. So we'll go into the B tier. Then the 1977 winner, Jason Robards again for Julia, and where All the President's Men, his win makes total sense. This one doesn't at all. He essentially got the Oscar for playing Dashiell Hammett and growing out a mustache, but he has maybe 4 or 5 lines in the entire movie. He'll look over his glasses and say, "Good job," or "You got to keep on writing," and that's it. It's just a strange win because he's a non-character within the film. It's not necessarily a bad performance, but it's just a baffling win because he's not really within the film. He's definitely not memorable, and I think even people that have seen Julia and haven't seen it in a long time will go, "Wait, who is Jason Robards in the movie again?" He's just a very strange win because he's just not in the movie that much. and he's not memorable within the scenes that he's in, just only because he's playing, I guess, a famous person, and because people really like Jason Robards at this time, they decided to give him the win. But for me, that's not enough, so it'll have to go into the D tier. Then the 1978 winner, Christopher Walken for The Deer Hunter. A very intense performance, but still an iconic performance within Walken's career. Of course, we have the first half in which he's very shy and innocent, and we see more of the humanity with him, which is a pivotal part, because when we get to the second half and we've seen, in particular, Walken's character really sort of lose it and really become a zombie and lost in Vietnam, we understand where he's coming from, because Walken sort of injected a lot of the humanity, but also sort of the shyness and the awkwardness that this man had, and gave him a real sort of 360 persona within the film. You know, oftentimes with these sort of back and forth with De Niro's character in that first half, I think Walken gives him a real sense of authenticity within the character, that this is a guy who maybe won't say his emotions outright, but will sort of hint at it, and some of the sort of brotherly love in a kind of a traditionally manly kind of a way. We're not necessarily always expressing the emotions directly, but sort of indirectly, and still being understood. So that sort of smart ways of making this feel like a real person, who maybe doesn't always want to showcase their emotion, that feels shy but still feels like a true genuine person within the inside. Those small decisions that they make within the first half of the movie really help to the heartbreak and the tragedy of the second half, in which he's also good at having that sort of 1,000-yard stare, where we understand that there's nothing in there, and we want to be like De Niro's character, want to bring him back, want to see something. But De Niro, Walken's character is so great at just having that sort of blank 1,000-yard stare to show just how broken this man is. So it's great. He's able to do both elements convincingly well, which is integral to the success of the film. So for me, this will go into the A tier. Then the 1979 winner is Melvin Douglas for Being There, and this is a very strange movie, but I've never been a huge fan of Hal Ashby and his work, so I wasn't a huge fan of this film. But that being said, I still want to look back and try to look at other people's reviews and figure out, do people like this performance? Because, you know, even when I'm watching the movie, I sort of understand, okay, well, it makes sense if people like, of course, Peter Sellers being the main one, or, you know, Shirley MacLaine's character, that makes sense there. But, you know, people even like Melvin Douglas's performance. Is this one of the standout performances from the film? I looked at the Letterboxd reviews for a few pages, and nobody mentioned Melvin Douglas. I even tried to look at older reviews, and very few people mentioned Melvin Douglas as big standout of the film. So it seems like it was more of an unfortunate case of the It's Time award, giving someone, you know, who's near death, who's had a great career, an award for a movie. And, you know, ultimately at the end of the day, I don't love those performances, because usually those performances aren't that great. They're giving them a reward, sort of recognizing that they probably should have given them an award for something else later on, and it's more of a career kind of award. But at the end of the day, we just judge the performances themselves, and the performance here is very okay. It's sweet, it's nice. We like that he likes Chauncey Gardner and sort of sticks up for him. But even still, after watching the movie over a week ago now, trying to remember some iconic moments or lines from the film from Douglas's character, and there really isn't much in that regard. It seems like more of a career Oscar, and more of an Oscar going to somebody whose character has a sort of interesting arc within the film, and a tragic arc within the film, but not necessarily the performance itself. So for me, it will go into the C tier. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Comment below. Please let me know your tier ranking if you've seen these. Subscribe to the channel so you stay tuned for next week, when we're going to be covering the Best Supporting Actress category in the 2010s. Some interesting winners. I think the Supporting Actress category, surprisingly, has got some really good winners over the past few decades, especially the 2010s and the 2000s. I started to take a look at them, and I was like, oh, you know, these are actually pretty good. These are all pretty solid. So it'll be a fun episode to do, I think. But that's about it. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. And until next time, stay tuned.